Thanks for your welcome, Jan. I'll tell you just a little bit more about me. I grew up around the Kingaroy area, on the Toowoomba sort of side, around Maidenwell specifically. Mostly, there was a few other places before we moved there, but I moved there when I was about 6. Went to Tangerine Primary School, and left home when I was 17 and went off to Avondale and trained for ministry, and was in ministry for, around 33 years or so. I had a couple of breaks during that period for a few different reasons. Always liked the Toogoolawah Valley and ended up moving there at the beginning of 2021. So I knew Phil down in ministry up north, and that's I guess how come I get to be here, because he invites me. So I actually had my best mate in high school, lived right here in Blackbutt, just up in the centre of town, in one of the little houses on the left, just past the crossroads in town. That's where Paul Dreghorn, interesting name, lived. And I've caught up with him just since we've moved back here. He actually lives in West Oz, but his mum still lives just up the road there. So, high school was not a pleasant experience for us in Yarraman. Being a Seventh-day Adventist, I didn't get involved in a lot of stuff that other guys got involved in, and I won't mention some of it because it's pretty deplorable. And that made me a bit of a target, plus the fact that I had dark red hair and lots of freckles. That didn't help either. And so I was a bit of a misfit, social outcast in high school. And when I met up with Paul just a couple of years ago for the first time since high school, I actually thought, well, with a name like that, he can't be hard to find on Facebook. And I contacted him on Facebook, and he doesn't use Facebook, and I don't really either, but we both have accounts that we don't really use much. He saw it eventually and responded, and we met up when he was over here to see his mum. And we were talking a little bit about those days, and he said those guys are a bunch of, and I won't use the term that he used, but it was very unpleasant. It was extremely unpleasant. There were things that happened that made life quite miserable. And things weren't very happy for me at home either, so I never ever told my parents about it. And it was a tough time. But by God's grace, hung in there and didn't let it turn me away from Him. So today, I would like to work through chapter 24 of Matthew with you, and it's more of a Bible study than a sermon. But I guess the reason I've chosen this topic today is that I've been hearing quite a few people say certain things as a result of the election that's just taken place in the United States. And I agree that it's very possible that Donald Trump could be a president to bring things to a crescendo. But I also want us to be careful that we don't embarrass ourselves in what we say about what this might mean in the world. I remember in the year 1999, as the year 2000 was approaching, and you probably had this experience as well, a lot of people were very apprehensive and thinking that 2000 was going to be some massive watershed year, and very likely, I was working in the Pacific Islands at the time, and I had a lot of people talk to me about their expectation that Jesus would come in 2000. And, I remember trying to work with whole churches about how there was no biblical foundation to believe that the year 2000 was a prophetic year. It doesn't even line up up with 2,000 years from the time of Christ and stuff like that. But there was a lot of hype. And I have a book in my library which is called The Last Days Are Here Again. And it traces the history of the expectation of the imminence, or the imminent return of Jesus Christ. When Martin Luther was alive, he said he couldn't imagine that the coming of Christ could be any further than 300 years ago. Well, that was 500 years ago, and Jesus is still not here. So, of course, this whole concept of Jesus is coming soon is one that is a little bit of a kind of a tension in our faith in Christ, because the Bible says Jesus is coming soon. We believe he's coming soon, but we need to be mature about how we deal with that. Now, I want to say up front that I believe that we have seen a lot of prophecies fulfilled that show us that we are right in front of the event of Jesus' return. So much more so even than when I was born. But that doesn't mean to say that we can start guessing, or should start guessing, at when Jesus is coming. When I was in Victoria just a few years ago, I had to deal with some people in a couple of churches I worked at who were very much into the great timeline, and they were very much focused on the fact that they believed that the earth would exist for 6,000 years, and they were trying to pinpoint when the earth was created and when 6,000 years would be up. And even guys like Walter Wyeth are stepping very close to the concept that 2027 is very possibly a year when Jesus may return. Now, he hasn't said that exactly, but he keeps putting these little sort of hints out there that suggest that. And so I am not going to go into analysing all the statements from Ellen White, because she says around 6,000, she says 6,000, she says roughly 6,000, something like that. But she also says we do not have a message based on time. We have no message to share which is based on time, and she says we need to get away from time excitement, that our hope in Jesus should be based on who Jesus is and what he's done for us, and not based on, he might come this year or next year. She says we cannot say that he will come in 5, 10 or 20 years. Neither should we say that he will not come in a year, basically. That we just don't go there. It's not a place we should go. And so I want to have a look at Matthew 24, and I just want to highlight some of the key points that are shared in this chapter. And of course it is the most comprehensive chapter that deals with the coming of Jesus in all of the Gospels. So we're looking at the words of Christ here, if you have a red letter edition, virtually the entire chapter except for verses 1 to 3. In fact, I think everything is a monologue from Jesus after verse, basically from partway through verse 4. But the introduction to the chapter is incredibly important. So the introduction and the setting is that they're at the temple. The disciples try to give Jesus a guided tour of the temple. And I'm often curious about that. Why did they feel that he needed a guided tour of the temple? Because he'd been in the temple many times. But for some reason, they felt the need to, sort of escort Jesus around, and somehow it almost seems like they wanted to impress him with how magnificent the temple was. And it was magnificent, despite the fact that it was, you remember the story from the Old Testament, how the people who had known the temple before it was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then they rebuilt the temple, they wept for how paltry the temple was compared to Solomon's temple. But then that temple was destroyed anyway, pretty much, and rebuilt by Herod. And it wasn't it was about the same, basically, as the one that was built after the Babylonian captivity. But the point is, Jesus wasn't interested in the tour. It seems like he just brushed them off. But he brushed them off with a very significant statement which turned their minds to other things. And he said, of course, this verse 2 of 24, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, if you go to the Wailing Wall at Jerusalem, you might be tempted to say, well, Jesus' prophecy didn't come true because there's still stones standing on top of each other at the Wailing Wall. I've never really read much that tries to address that concept, but I understand that, when Jesus spoke that, he was talking about the stones they could see. The stones that are at the Wailing Wall are the exposed foundation stones, which were basically underground at the time when the temple stood there. So, some of Jesus' statements, and many Bible statements, we shouldn't take to the absolute nth degree. When Paul said, "I am all things to all men, that by all means I might save some," would you think that that included bribing people to become Christians? Would you think that would include, threatening them with death if they didn't become a Christian?
Becoming alcoholic to be Christian.
Yeah, becoming a male prostitute to impress the male prostitutes at the temple to Ephesus or whatever. No, clearly that was a general statement which had limitations. It was an all-encompassing statement. I am all things to all men, but with obvious limitations. And by all means I might save some? No, all appropriate means, but he just didn't go to use every word necessary to make that clear. And so Jesus himself used hyperbole on a number of occasions. And I'm not saying he's using hyperbole here, but the fact is, when the Romans destroyed the temple, they levelled the temple, and whether there were 2 stones left on top of each other out of the whole temple, that's not the point. He's saying the temple will be levelled, and it was. And I don't think he was necessarily including the foundation stones in that. Okay, so that's just a little bit of historical stuff. Now, you notice it says, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, it's very obvious from this, for us, that there are 2 different events described here, but in the disciples' mind, they were thinking of one event. The destruction of the temple would be synonymous with the coming of Jesus and the destruction of the world. Ellen White makes this very clear that Jesus actually answered both questions as in one answer. He didn't separate the events in his answer. And also, as he describes the events around the destruction of the temple, they serve as a kind of a template, a scale model, you could say, of the destruction that would take place of the entire earth at his coming. And of course, when we say the destruction of the earth, we don't mean that the earth will cease to exist as a planet. The earth's not going to explode and disappear. We're talking about the destruction of the earth, as in Revelation talks about, everything being burned up with fire and so forth. But that doesn't mean the earth will no longer be here. It says all its works are burned with fire. So everything that's been built will be burned. And of course there'll be destruction of mountains and disappearance of islands and all those sorts of things as well. But I just want to draw your attention particularly to the first thing that Jesus says, and it's very significant. The first response Jesus gives is what? What's he saying? Yeah, be careful. Be careful when you think about this topic. Be careful that you don't get deceived. And 3 times Jesus warns us not to be deceived through this chapter. So the first time is, of course, in verse 4. He says, take heed that no one deceives you. The next time is in verse 11. He says, then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And the next one is in verse, what is it? I didn't write it down. Verse 24 and 5. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So 3 times, very significantly, Jesus specifies that we should be very careful not to be deceived. And that's significant when you think about the fact that today, if you do a search, I believe you'll discover that the majority position held by most Christians about the second coming is within the framework of what we call the dispensational prophetic view, which incorporates a secret rapture. So many Christians have spiritualised the coming of Jesus, as I heard an Anglican priest saying on a forum in Britain some years ago, quite a while ago, now more than 20 years ago. He was mocking the Adventist pastor in this very public televised forum. He said, you Adventists, you take everything so literally. We know that when Jesus talked about coming back, he wasn't actually saying he was physically going to return to the earth. It was a spiritual return he was talking about. We worked that out hundreds of years ago, and you guys still haven't picked it up. And so, that's one position. I remember, I didn't personally speak to him, but a friend of mine, the pastor, spoke to this guy who was a Methodist, and he was saying, we don't believe that Jesus will literally return to the earth. And my friend said, but John Wesley believed that, the founder of the Methodist Church. And the guy said, well, Wesley was wrong. And so, there is this position that the coming of Jesus is really when Jesus confronts individuals and challenges them as to how they will respond to the message of Christ. But then there is, there's been a few different positions, and you know that before the Seventh-day Adventist Church arose, most of the Christian world were what they call post-millennialists, that Jesus would come after the 1,000 years of world peace. And they were all looking to establish, particularly, this is part of the reason why the American, the establishment of Christianity in America was so important to those Puritan and Reform leaders, because they were hoping up to set up the millennium, the 1,000 years of peace on the earth, sort of led by America, the New World. But of course, since that time, it has swung back to being mostly premillennial. So most people think the millennium will be after the time of Christ now, the time of Jesus' return, but it has been heavily dominated by the position of the dispensationalism, which had its foundation in the Plymouth Brethren and John Darby. So you would have heard of him probably, but if you haven't, you can go and research that. And that's found its way into most of the sort of active denominations, fairly much into the Baptist Church, very much into the Assemblies of God and all the branches of Christianity that have come out of the Assemblies of God. So, and then there's others who really just don't address the issue anymore. They just kind of avoided, I guess. So, like many people, I heard a Lutheran pastor say, Revelation's so hard to understand, it's not even worth trying. And another Lutheran minister said, maybe an Anglican, but anyway, he said, Revelations, there's so many different interpretations of Revelation, it's just not worth getting into. And so, yeah, it's very interesting as we read through this chapter of Matthew 24 that there are quite a few parallels with Revelation chapter 13 as well, which I don't know that is often highlighted. Let's go through the chapter fairly quickly. Jesus goes on from verse 4 to say, many will come in my name saying, I am Christ, and will deceive many. That happened immediately after the time of Christ. There was something like 70 false messiahs who claimed to be the Messiah from the time of Jesus between then and the destruction of Jerusalem. Some were before him, of course, and some were after him. It says, you will hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. And I get a little bit disappointed when I hear Adventist pastors talking about there's so many wars around, Jesus must be about to return. That's nonsense, because wars have been going on forever, almost. And Jesus says, don't get too excited because you hear wars and rumours of wars, because these things are going to happen, but that doesn't mean the end is about to happen. And then it says, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. And it says, all these things are the beginning of sorrows. Now the Greek word here is actually best translated, as it is in the New Living Translation, as birth pains. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Now, I don't know, but I'm guessing most of the ladies here have given birth to children, and maybe the men involved have kind of witnessed that or been aware of it. Birth pains can be very deceiving, can't they? They can go on for a long time. Sometimes they can go very short. But the point is, you know when the birth pains happen that you're somewhere near the time of the child being born. Doesn't mean to say it's going to happen today. But it's a process which usually means you get some twinges which become a bit more painful, and then they become more and more painful until the crescendo of the actual birth, when they're extremely painful. So I'm told. That didn't affect me at all. But, ladies tell us, I've had some very interesting descriptions of how you could compare the pain. And I'm glad I was born male. That's all I can say. I don't think I ever would have chosen to have a child if I was born female, but I'm glad some ladies do, because we would all be gone, we'd be finished as a species if they didn't. Okay, so this is what the Bible is using as an illustration of the trouble leading up to the time of Christ. Now, for the lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem, we saw this sort of thing. It got worse and worse and worse until the great disaster of the destruction of Jerusalem. And fairly clearly, this is a model for the whole world. It's interesting to note that historians still agree that the destruction of life and property, but particularly life, at the destruction of Jerusalem is one of the greatest single losses of human life in one place, in one event, in the history of the world. Things that you could compare it to, I guess, are the siege of Stalingrad during the Second World War. That was getting up there. But as I understand it, it was only around about a quarter, let's say only, it was around about 250,000 people died in Stalingrad. But the similarities to the destruction of Jerusalem are pretty strong. we often hear of the heroes of Stalingrad who fought the Germans and whatever, but there were people in Stalingrad who made their living by kidnapping children for the purposes of providing food for others. There was all sorts of betrayal and terrible violence that took place during that period amongst the people who were besieged, let alone the violence that took place from the Germans and against the Germans. And when people are faced with the decision to either starve to death or live by doing something terrible, sadly most will choose to do something terrible. And it's pretty depressing to read the details of what went on in Stalingrad. So that's a fairly modern example, but still in all, probably only about a third of the number of people died in Stalingrad who did in Jerusalem. We don't know the numbers. Josephus says it was around 1 million people who died. Other estimates put it closer to 350 to 400,000. But generally historians agree that it was somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million people died in those couple of years during the siege of Jerusalem, which is hard to comprehend. That's half the population of Brisbane, basically. Maybe a quarter of the population now. I don't know what it is these days. I think it's closer to 2 million if it's take Greater Brisbane into account. That's a lot of people. And the circumstances under which they died were terrible. There were 3 main factions fighting each other within the city, and then they were fighting the Romans. And the Romans were fighting them, obviously. There were whole forests that were cut down and used to make crosses to crucify people who tried to escape. And historians say that the crosses on the ground were so thick around Jerusalem that it was difficult to walk between. Hard to imagine each of those crosses holding a decaying human body. Just beyond comprehension. And of course, some of you know what the Romans found when they broke in, and I won't share what that was, but if you don't know, go and look it up if you're interested. There were just scenes of horror and desperation which have not often been repeated. But similar to the siege, by the Assyrians of Samaria and so forth. Terrible, terrible things that humans did to each other because of the desperation of their situation. And so in verse 9 it says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another." And this happened to a fair extent in Palestine, in Judea and other parts of the world in the lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem. But of course, this is a very clear parallel to Revelation 13 with the establishment of the mark of the beast, the image of the beast, and the mark of the beast. This is quite clearly a parallel to what's described in Revelation 13. And it says, then many false prophets will rise and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And that tiny little verse is like almost the crescendo of the whole chapter. He who endures to the end will be saved. And that's what we've got to really focus on, I believe, that God, we need to pray that God will give us the strength to endure. And I wanted to say earlier, and I forgot, but I'll share it now. I just want to encourage you as a little group of believers meeting here regularly in Blackbutt, don't be discouraged by the fact there's not many of you. It's still significant in God's eyes. It's still significant. And I encourage you to faithfulness in that. If you've ever seen those satellite pictures of the world at night time, have you noticed all the little lights? And as you look as they cruise over India, they're intense. There's just light everywhere. But when you get over Africa and Australia and places, you see little clusters of light, but then occasional spots of light here and there. And in the darkness of this world, from God's view, every little flicker of light is important, because that's where he's being represented. And so I encourage you in faithfulness for that reason. And of course for your own well-being. And you notice it says in verse 14, and this is really the great statement of the chapter: this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Many have grappled with that statement, because what does it mean to preach the gospel in all the world? To witness, as a witness to all nations. And our church, the General Conference headquarters has grappled with that, and they've tried to say, well, let's try and focus every single people group on earth. And remember, some years back there was this initiative to try and identify every people group of at least 1 million people, and make sure we've got a presence there to share the gospel and the three angels' messages with that group of people. Ultimately, none of us truly knows how God will determine that. That's in his mind. But what it surely says to us is that we need to take the gospel to all the world. And of course that balances or parallels very closely with Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7. Saw the first angel flying in the midst of heaven, saying, fear God and give glory to him, and worship him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who has made heaven and earth and the sea and everything that is in them. And of course it says this message is to go to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. So that's exactly what this statement is saying, that it needs to go to all the world. And we need to be part of that. And of course that's why our church has this initiative now called Everyone Shall Go, or I Shall Go, I should say, I Shall Go. Just encouraging every one of us to seek from God a task to do, to find out what God wants us to do. Because it's not up to the church, it's not up to the pastors, it's up to each one of us to do our part to take the gospel to all the world. And then in verse 15 it says, therefore when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those with nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight be not in winter or on the Sabbath. Now I had all the statistics to share with you, but time is against me. If you study the history of what happened at the time of the siege of Jerusalem, it's quite amazing. The Roman armies, and it's just not an easy story to understand, because there were all these guerrilla battles going on in the wider area of Palestine. But the Roman armies made it down to Jerusalem, and then for some reason that never seems to be known, they withdrew and went back towards Caesarea. And on the way they were attacked mercilessly by the Zealots and others. And when they got to Caesarea, the Zealots and this other group, they absolutely massacred the Romans and killed over 6,000 soldiers, which is noted as one of the worst defeats by a Roman power during the history of the Roman Empire. I was surprised to read that, because I thought there were worse, but it's a real standout event in their record. But the fact is that the Jews were pretty triumphant, and they thought, we've scared the Romans off, we beat them off, and they won't be back. And of course, the Christians, remembering what Jesus had said, left Jerusalem as soon as the Romans withdrew. Now it's very interesting that Jesus says, don't even go down and get your clothes. I've really struggled with that for years, and why does Jesus say that? Because it's not like they were going to take so long to just grab some clothes. Do you know how long it was till the Romans came back and set siege to Jerusalem? Sorry?
Was it one day?
No, it was nearly 7 months. And I reckon I could pack my bag in 7 months. But they left immediately. Why did Jesus say, go now, don't wait? He doesn't tell us why. But my guess is that if they delayed and said, well, we've got time. Of course, they didn't know how long they had for one thing. But Jesus could have told them. But he said, just get out of the place. And he left it as a real sense of urgency. If they had it delayed, maybe they would have said, well, maybe, we've probably got a week or so. They can't come back within a week. And maybe after a week they would have thought, oh, I just need to do this, I need to do that. And maybe they still would have been there when the Romans came back, I don't know. But it sounds like Jesus was stressing the urgency even more than was literally necessary. And we know that this is transferred to Revelation 13 when the mark of the beast is announced. We need to get out of the cities, preferably beforehand. And that's why Ellen White encouraged people to seek country living as much as possible, even in her day and in our day. And we've lived close to or in cities for much of our married life because that's where we're appointed to be. But I'm just so grateful that we're now living in the country, and every time we go down to the city I'm thinking, oh, I'm so glad I don't live here. The rush and the bustle, the hustle and the bustle, and all the traffic lights and the traffic, and if anything goes wrong, its impact just is massive. And of course COVID showed us how difficult life could be in the city under lockdowns. And we're encouraged to be in the country. I'm preaching to the converted here, and you're all in the country. But the fact is, it doesn't mean it's not going to impact us in the country either. It'll get there too. It's just that we'll have a bit more time. And it'll be interesting to see how many country people suddenly get new friends from the city when these things start really happening. Oh, can we come to your place? I reckon that'll happen. So it's good if we've got a bit of land, I think. But of course, it won't be long. We won't be able to pay our rates, so the council will want us gone anyway, or they'll sell our property or something, because that's what they do if you don't pay your rates. We don't know the details. But one thing I do believe is that we shouldn't stress about this. Jesus tells us to live one day at a time. When I was a boy, our church very irresponsibly used to show movies about the Inquisition and show people being burned at the stake and stuff like that. And I was terrified about the last days. Absolutely terrified. Never talked to anyone about it. I just absorbed all that stuff and churned away inside. But as I've read The Great Controversy, and the chapters in there that talk about God's protection, God's presence, his very real presence with us. Even as I've read books like Fox's Book of Martyrs or Tortured for Christ, I've come to realise that God keeps his promise absolutely when he says he'll be with us. That amazing book called Tortured for Christ, I met the guy who wrote that, Richard Wurmbrand. He actually said that if he was given his choice to live in the West in freedom, or to go through all the stuff he went through in that Romanian prison for 14 years, he would always choose his experience in the Romanian prison, because he said his closeness to Jesus was just so intense and so meaningful that he wouldn't trade it for anything. And he described some of the things they did, and I won't share the details now, but horrendous things. And yet he says, I wouldn't escape that if I had a choice, because that was just such an intense experience with Jesus Christ. And Ellen White in Great Controversy talks a lot about the fact that the presence of the angels will be present with us. Many of us will see the angels and converse with them. And the knowledge of the presence of Jesus will just be so comforting and helpful. Doesn't mean it won't be a hard time. It will be. But we don't need to fear it. We certainly don't need to let it disrupt our peace and our joy now. Jesus says, "These things I've told you, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full." So he doesn't want us to live in fear. We've not been given a spirit of fear, but of love and of a sound mind. So let's not fear it. Let's look forward to it with hope. And so, this is that passage in verses 15 to 17 or 19 is just such a significant passage. It makes it very clear to us that the dispensational interpretation of Daniel chapter 9 is not correct. If you actually study that, it's Daniel chapter 9 where they get this idea of the Antichrist being an individual who will rise up, be a world leader of Jewish origin, who will make a covenant with the Israelite nation and then turn against them and begin to persecute them and so forth. It's got nothing to do with that. The Prince of the Covenant is Jesus Christ, not the one who makes the covenant with the Jews at the end of time. It's Jesus Christ who's the Prince of the Covenant. And so, I believe we have a very strong and solid interpretation of Daniel chapter 9, which is the 70 weeks as part of the 2,300 days. And we can stay strong on that. Okay, so I just want to come down to the last part, and I know my time is blown. So I'm not going to go into the details on the actual descriptions of the coming of Jesus. I think they're pretty straightforward, but I just want to mention that in those details we have a very clear rebuttal of the dispensational view as well, and primarily in the fact that Jesus is giving us a description of the coming of Jesus so that nobody will think that it's going to happen in secret. When he says, "As the lightning comes out of the east and shines even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be," the dispensationalists, the secret rapturists, say it's just going to happen like that. It'll be just in the flash of lightning, it'll all be over. Those bumper stickers, "If you see this car with no driver, I've been raptured." Policies in the American Airlines company that said if the pilot was a Christian, the co-pilot had to be a non-Christian, so that if he was raptured, someone would be able to fly the plane. It was actual policy in their company. So, we laugh at it, but they take it very seriously. And so it's not about it's going to just happen in a flick of an eye. Jesus makes it very clear that it's going to be as obvious as lightning. It's going to be so obvious you won't need anyone to tell you, "Oh, Jesus is over there," or say, "Oh, he's hiding in some closet over there." No, you will see it. You won't need to watch it on the news. You won't need to get a message from the space station saying, "Oh, Jesus is headed past us, he must be on your way." No, we will know it. We won't need to be told it. And that's clearly the point of the passage. It's not saying you'll just be all over in the flash of lightning. It'll be so obvious. Okay, now we're going into 32 and following, and we're just going to go through this fairly quickly. Learn a parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also know when you see these things, know that it is near, even at the very doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things are fulfilled. Some scholars have said Jesus just got it wrong. He didn't know the timing of his return. But clearly we're not going to accept that. If we believe Jesus is the Son of God, he didn't get it wrong. So we need to understand that differently. What does he mean by that? Because clearly that generation is all gone. And clearly Jesus hasn't returned in the glorious way that we expect him. So I think this is a strong argument that shows that all those statements that he's made before were all going to happen in the next 40 to 50 years. And they did, in a local setting. But they haven't happened in a worldwide setting yet. It's not a cosmic event yet. And so, yeah, as we move on, of course he says, and of course, yeah, verse 35 is a very important reminder that his words will not pass away even though heaven and earth will pass away. So we should never start doubting Jesus and say, yeah, maybe we just ignore that part. He probably got that wrong. We'll just take the parts that we think are plausible and we'll believe those. That doesn't work. It's always going to bring us undone. Okay, 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, no, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Do you know what some Adventists who've set time have said to that? In recent times I'm talking about, not just the Adventists in William Miller's day. They say, yeah, Jesus was talking about the people who were alive then, but we can know because we've got more information. Do you think that's a safe interpretation? Clearly not. Jesus is saying this has not been revealed. And Jesus is clearly, intentionally keeping it from us. He could have told us. He must know now anyway. He may not have known while he was on earth. I'm sure he knows now. I'm not going to be dogmatic on that. Maybe it's something the Father has chosen to keep to himself, but I kind of doubt that. But the fact is, he's making it very clear he's not telling us. And that's brought out so clearly in Acts chapter 1 verse 8. You know when the disciples come and they say, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he says, mind your own business. He doesn't literally say that, but effectively he does, because he says, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons. So there, just butt out. It's not your business. Stop trying to guess it. But then he goes on to say, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth. So I like to paraphrase that by saying Jesus said, mind your own business, get on with the work that I've given you to do. Just quit this trying to guess when Jesus is coming back. And there are still Seventh-day Adventists who try to do that. And I just say to them, look, this is not our purpose. Our purpose is to do the work to try and hasten that day. And leave the timing with Jesus. Be ready every day like Ernest Shackleton's men were. Be ready because you don't even know if you're going to be alive tomorrow. None of us knows that. We could be dead. I've had a few funerals recently of people who I wasn't expecting to die when they died. And it can happen to any of us. It's made me confront my mortality even a bit more so. And you just got to every day say, if this is my last day, Lord, I want to spend it with you. So be ready, because we do not know. And that's the message of the rest of the chapter. I'm not going to go through it because you know it well. You can read it yourselves. You notice the story of the unfaithful or the faithful servant. Jesus sort of gives the principle and then he tells the parable. And the central point here, of course, is be ready at all times so that you are never caught out by surprise. And, that's what the message of Scripture is all the way through. It's not just Jesus says it, but the apostles come in and say, well, Jesus said that, but really we can find it out. No. Let's just look at our last verse, which is 2 Thessalonians chapter 5. Actually, it's the second or first, sorry. I didn't write it down. I usually can remember it. Might be 1 Thessalonians 5. Yeah, sorry, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And we're going to read verses 1 to 6. It says, "But concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labour pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief." And that is like the key point. He says it is coming as a thief in the night, but for those who are children of the light, it's not really going to happen like a thief in the night, because we're expecting it. We may not know the timing, but we know it's going to happen. And we know that we are to be ready at all times. So therefore, none of us should be taken by surprise. You are all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. On April 1 in 1946, the tsunami siren warnings, or warning sirens, in Hilo, Hawaii, began to wail. And everybody knew that the sirens meant that they should move from, sea level down at the beach to higher ground. And many people did move, but some people said, "We've heard it before, and it's never happened. We've never had a tsunami. We won't have one this time." And so some of them actually wandered down to the shoreline to see what would happen. And after some hours, suddenly the sea receded and out for a number of kilometres out to sea. The water disappeared, and then the tidal wave came, a tsunami. Travelling at some 600 kilometres an hour, a 10-metre wall of water moved towards the shore at the speed of almost 600 miles an hour. Actually, it was nearly 1,000 kilometres an hour. This thing was just rushing in. And when it was all over, and they came down to the shore afterwards, they found at least 70 bodies strewn on the beach, and obviously further inland. People who died needlessly because they refused to heed the warning. And we've all heard, when I was about 15 years old, no, obviously I was younger, because there was this big fear in the church. I don't know if any of you were aware of it at the time, but there was a lot of people saying Jesus was coming back in 1975 because some person had a vision and they were told that Jesus would come back in 1975. And I remember as a kid being terrified, because I thought, I might get burned at the stake or something like that. I wasn't fearful so much of Jesus coming, but what might precede it. And I've heard many different guesses at when Jesus is coming, and we're all aware of those sorts of things. But the fact is that we need to be prepared every day, so that when Jesus comes, we'll be able to look up and greet him with open arms and say, "Lo, this is our Lord, and he will save us." May that be each of our experiences, I pray, in Jesus' name.